the only way to work through something is through it, which is to the point that you're trying to make. Sometimes you just have to let it wash over you.
Can't go under it, can't go around it, can't go over it, got to go through it.
Feel it, and
because you know what? In every trauma, there's a lesson.
Yeah, if you can focus more on the lesson and less about the pain.
That's what I'm saying. So be open to it and just be like fillet yourself open and let it. Listen to your intuition. Your intuition is going to tell you why it's happening. I mean, I'm telling you, if you listen, if you're attent, you're going to learn what the teachable moment is. It's probably a good way to say it, and then you can adjust. Seems like yesterday we just kicked off our very first conversation.
So many conversations.
Yeah. I just want to make a public service announcement.
Uh-oh, I'm scared.
Yeah, from last time we talked.
Oh, my gosh. You don't have to make
No, I think it's good. The banter that we started with when I was being...
You're going to explain yourself?
When I was being mouthy with you, just kidding around, telling you to shut up. It was really kind of a play off the toxic relationship from 2 episodes ago. So I in no way intentionally meant it. It sounded funny in my head. A lot of things sound funnier in my head.
You had to get a whooping when you came home?
Yeah.
No.
A lot of things sound much funnier in my head than when it came out of my mouth. I was like, it didn't sound so good. But anyway.
I knew you were joking.
I knew you did. But
and
this
you were
is,
quoting a movie. This
is for our audience. That I don't want them to think that I speak to you that way. First of all, I wouldn't. Second of all, you'd whip me in the shade if I ever did. So you wouldn't stand for it. So,
all right, now that we have that cleared
that is
up,
my confession.
Okay.
But
you
anyway,
are forgiven.
Thank you. But anyway, but I think it's a great segue into today's conversation.
Trauma.
Yeah, trauma.
Emotional trauma.
Yeah, emotional trauma. But I think it kind of dovetails well with communication styles, right? And the reason I say that is I was thinking about this is like how we speak and how we connect and how we communicate. The filter by which we do that is often determined by
things we've experienced, in the past.
The trauma we've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so when we were driving the other day and we were talking about topics that we thought we would want to discuss in here, and you said, "Hey, this is a really good one to talk about." And some more I thought about it. I thought, wow, boy, this could. I think it speaks to everybody, but it's such a large, I don't want to say complicated, but complex.
Yeah. Well, I know I was saying, like, I get mad at myself. I think I'm over a past, I hate the word trauma. I know we've talked about this, but a past scar from what I experienced in the past. And I think I'm over it. And I know in my mind, like, look forward. I have all, earlier videos we gave like tips on how to move on and forgiveness and all that. But every now and then it rears its ugly head, and I kind of home back in on past traumas that, I guess I haven't quite worked through.
Yeah, I don't know if we ever. I want to say that I don't know if we ever really worked through them all. Not only that, but like, aren't we always kind of experiencing like new trauma in different ways? I just think this is a really interesting conversation because from a direct relationship, but also a metaphoric relationship, your past experience. I mean, you are, an operating room nurse, and that's where you've spent the majority of your life. So I think if anybody really understands the physical aspect of trauma.
And I think that's why I hate using it for like things that in some people's eyes may not seem like a trauma per se. So I'm searching for another word to use because, when I hear trauma, I think of something like horrific. Mm-hmm. And there's different degrees. And I mean, it really doesn't matter what you perceive the degree of severity to be. It's what it's done to that person emotionally and what kind of scar it's left behind. It's all significant, is my point.
It's all significant, and you're right, it's all relative. So as I was thinking more and more about this conversation, I thought, like this, if you could take the same type of trauma and have two different people experience it, they're gonna experience it completely different, right? So, for example, you may have one person who's had a parent that was always stern with them, and maybe that's just the extent it was. It was they always spoke sternly to them, and that person may have been such an empath or so sensitive that really affected them, and to them that's trauma, and that's real. I mean, that's
Right. And you might hear someone else say, "Oh, get over it. It's
Right.
not that bad."
right. That's valid, and then you might have the same another person experience the same type, have the same type of experience, and it had no effect on them.
Right.
And it's because of how they're wired differently, right?
Yeah, you really can't invalidate someone else's experience.
That's right. And we'll get into this a little bit because I think the biggest I'll come up with that something. I can't think of the word, but the biggest problem with that is when you invalidate yourself. Right, when you invalidate your own, but I think we'll talk about that in a little bit.
And you kind of push it to the back and you don't deal with it because you think, oh, I shouldn't feel this way about that, and you just try to stuff it under the rug, and then it just keeps kind of coming back up throughout your life.
So I
and
think
your relationships.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think for the basis state, what we're talking about is emotional trauma, mental trauma. That's not to take away from the physical trauma, and oftentimes physical trauma is the precursor to emotional trauma. There's so many different directions to go on this. So just like you, I know people have experienced, the spectrum of trauma. I know obviously people that have been through a divorce. I know people that have been abused. I've watched abuse verbally, physically, emotionally.
Well, traumas that were to no one's fault. Like my mom lost her mother when she was 3 years old. So that changed her whole course of her life.
That's right. Right. Exactly. I know people that I know a person that was in a train accident. I know a person that was attacked by a shark. That'd be horrible. I do, and lost part of their leg. So
I'm not laughing. It's just you have so many stories. It sounds like
no. I'm just
like
mean
they can be real.
And these are all traumas in the whole spectrum, right? And they all have experienced a trauma in different ways, and some of those are physical, some are emotional, some are physical. It's this big conglomeration of mixing, and I like to say that is, fortunately or unfortunately, the human experience, right?
So how do we, Mr. Sargent, let go of some of these negative traumas that are impacting our life in a negative way down the line?
Well.
Don't you have all the answers?
Yeah, I read this book. No, with that, I think there's a ton, especially today. Certainly, there's way more good information available today than there's ever been.
Well, there's more of a conversation today than there's ever been too, I think.
Right. Yes, I think back in the, in the 40s and 50s when I was growing up. But there wasn't the access to
all right,
information.
he's really not that old. He's
Right.
old, but he's not that old.
There was really not that much information to go and pull from, and you had to rely on some different avenues. So I'm not saying it makes it easier to deal with trauma. And I kind of wanted to lay this foundation first, before we get into it. Maybe how you deal with it, or how, maybe I shouldn't say how I've dealt with it, because we've all dealt with different trauma. So there's a lot of resources, and I think it does people well to go and pull from look for those resources. I mean, everyone has an opinion. You have to be really careful about that. But
well, and I think there's different answers for different situations and different peoples. There's not one set rule to help you get over a past trauma.
You're right. There's not. And again, it's as unique as each individual, right? You have to find that process or therapy, if you will, that fits you.
Yeah, I do think
there's not one size fits all.
Right. I do think the first step, though, is overall, you have to talk about it. You have to get it out. You can't ignore it anymore. You can't keep stuffing it down. You have to be honest with yourself and honest with, if it's something you have to have a conversation with someone else about. You just kind of have to lay it all out on the table.
Mm-hmm. I think to even go one step before that is you have to acknowledge.
That's true. Sometimes there's traumas lurking that you're not even realize have made you helps shape you into a certain way that you are.
Right. And that I think that only comes from being intentional and being aware to go and actually kind of do some self work. And we've talked about this in some other of our conversations. But I think it's just good, healthy self work to sit down and say, hey, where am I at? Who do I think that I am? What do I think I'm struggling with, and where do I want to be? And that's always kind of a good place.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, to write it down. I say write it down because I'm that kind of person. But if it helps to record it. If it helps to get it out in like music, like a lot of people do, get it out in music or whatever
Totally agree.
whatever method or whatever vehicle works for you. Do that because. And it can just be a cerebral thing. Just let it flow out of you. Write it down. It doesn't have to make sense, but now you've got it on paper, so you can actually go back and have something.
I wasn't even a writer. I'm not a writer per se, but when I got online and looked what to help me like get through my divorce and all these emotions and all these questions I had running through my head, it said to journal, and so I did, and it was so cathartic for me. And then it was so cool to look back through the progression of that journal and the healing that was taking place that I didn't even realize. So that was really cool to kind of look back on after I had gotten through the darkest point.
Yeah. Not only does it help you begin to identify and work with it right then, but down the road, it's always a good reference. And it could just, if nothing else, it could be a good reference to help.
Well, it's getting those feelings out. Like, I said, talk to someone, but sometimes you're not ready to talk to someone, or you may be a little embarrassed and uncomfortable with how you're feeling during a situation. So that's when journaling is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. I tend to believe that we are nothing more than emotional filters. And if you can think of what a filter does, right, it just picks up stuff, and the idea from a filter is to pick up the crappy stuff and let the good stuff flow through. But after a while, all filters kind of get clogged up. We're no different. There's biological creatures that we are. We're emotional filters. So we're going to get bogged down with traumas. And whatever that label is and whatever it is to you is a trauma. So if you're at so there's some kind of litmus test or some things you can kind of stop and take a look at is if you are engaging in behavior that you find is addictive, or you're constantly doing, but you're not comfortable with it, or you don't want to do that anymore, or you feel like there's it's not who you want to be. That's a good place to start. Just one of many. And if you feel like there's roadblocks in your life that you are keeping you from being the person you want to be, or accomplishing what you want to accomplish, or having what you want to have, or doing what you want to do, it's often good. I think the best place to start with yourself and look in and say, and we talked about this last week, right? What are my belief patterns? What are my thought patterns? What is the conversation I'm having internally? And if you can step back and take a diagnostic approach to it, as opposed to an emotional approach, and say, what am I doing? What's the cause and what's the effect? What am I doing, and what's the result I'm getting?
Yeah.
It seems a little bit scientific approach, but I think sometimes in order to get clarity,
sometimes you have to step out of the emotion because you get so wrapped up in the emotion and how that situation made you feel. You get very tunnel vision. I think it's kind of hard to pull out of it.
100%.
So focused on that.
You hear people tell all the time, don't make a big decision when you're in an emotional state. There's a reason for that, right? You're not often going to make the right decision. That's not to take away from listen to your intuition. That's not what we're talking about. But when you're hyped up in an emotional state, that's not the best time. You don't have the best. You don't have the best clarity with that. So, I think the first thing is acknowledging we all have trauma. Acknowledging that we've experienced trauma. And so speaking for me, okay, I know there's things going on in my life, there were things going on in my life that I felt intuitively I just wasn't dealing with. So the first step was being intentional, say, whatever it is, I'm going to deal with it. And I think it's almost like kind of you hear about Alcoholics Anonymous, they say the first step to recovery is admittance.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a good lesson across our lives.
Yeah. And didn't you get into a book, like kind of like a workbook that kind of helped you work through some past issues you had with your dad?
You mean
remember that book?
my past marriage or my?
No, it was over your dad and forgiveness in the past.
Yeah, you know what? You're right. There was, and I can't really. Now you're gonna make me think. I can't think of that.
I know. I
It
can't
was a
remember
little
what
bit
it's
at
called.
workbook, but what it was it was some poignant questions to help me begin to ask. There were ideas to help me ask the right questions and see what those answers were. And not all of them turned up to be anything with substance, but some of them were.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think it kind of helped you take the focus off the hurt and look at kind of the whole picture, and not to say certain behaviors were acceptable or okay, but just to make you kind of look at it from a different angle and to kind of let go of some of that pain and anger.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. So that was kind of the progression. And one thing that I learned for me personally, and I've shared this with my children, and you and I have talked about it in the past. I've shared it with other friends when they're like right in the thick of things, whether they're right in, in an emotional state. And I will say that anxiety, depression, all of these labels, more often than not, stem out of some unresolved trauma, some unresolved experience or experiences in your life. Because what happens is there's a fragmentation in a person that they're not. When I say integrity, I don't mean the character. It's almost like the hull of a ship. You say, in the Navy, it's like, there's integrity to the hull, which means it's sound in the inside and it's sound on the outside. It's whole. So you think about that as your person. So.
Yeah, something's rattled you emotionally, or
yeah. There's
stayed with you. Something that stayed with you.
Right. There's a disconnect. So I used to tell people all the time is like, one of the for me, what really helped me begin to effectively or productively deal with these unresolved traumas or issues in my life was being willing to face it. And I like to use the analogy of so often when we're faced with something that is overwhelming, doesn't matter what it is. It could be fear, could be, it doesn't matter. There's a litany of things, but our tendency is to struggle against it. So let's say, for example, people who are dealing with serious bouts of anxiety. If you've never experienced it, it can be debilitating. Our tendency is, without thinking about it, is we struggle. Like there's this internal fight between trying not to lose it to anxiety and feeling like you're spiraling out of control and staying calm. Well, the more you fight it, the worse it's going to get. That's not, that doesn't work. It might work for a little bit of time, but it doesn't resolve the issue. It's counterintuitive, but what really works is when you're willing to stand and face it. So the analogy that I use is imagine standing in the surf in the ocean, and these big waves are just kind of coming in, wave after wave, and just hammering you. And anybody that's gone out and swam in the ocean knows when they're waist deep and the waves are up, it can just bowl you over. The analogy is you stand there and just let those waves, let those emotions, let all of that discomfort just hit you, and let it have its full work in you. It's going to be unpleasant. You're going to feel out of control. You're going to feel all these range of negative, nasty emotions that are just really uncomfortable. However, if you can be disciplined to just accept that, knowing that's not going to kill you, and let it continually hammer on you, guess what? It begins to dissipate. Because you're letting it kind of flow through. I can't really explain it scientifically. I'm just telling you that this is what it works. So facing it and being willing to face it and saying, I know it's going to be uncomfortable, but I'm going to let all of those emotions and feelings have their way with me until it starts to lessen. And it's different for every person. Some days it may be a day. Might be a week, might be a month, might be longer. It just
Yeah.
depends. So that's the first step.
Yeah. I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Of the waves.
Yeah, and then and as you're working through that, I think the other thing that you were talking about, in say specifically with relation to my father, was, I guess, embracing or realizing or accepting the fact or the truth that he had his own trauma, and he was. I don't want to I don't say this to excuse anybody, but so much of the trauma that we face are at the hands of other people. If you really think about it, and it's when we go through something, there's always someone that we're usually blaming as a result. And I'm not saying that person is or isn't the cause. What I am saying is we all are on this journey. We're all experiencing trauma, and we all project this out. And sometimes we are the recipient, and sometimes we're the antagonist. So when I realized that in this case, my father, and later life, other people were just trying to struggle, and maybe they hadn't dealt with their own trauma, so they were repeating behavior, it began to let me find some...
Let go of some of the anger surrounding it.
Yeah.
It gave you more empathy.
It did. It gave me more empathy. It gave me more. I felt like it gives you more of your own strength back, your own voice, your own control. But I don't know. It's just this sense of that's really is you learn to let go. You just gotta learn to let go of what happened to you. Again.
But what do you do when it keeps rearing its ugly head every now and then? Does it ever really go away? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I that would actually be great to talk with some people that have a lot more years under their belt than you and I do, and see that have been through. I think when I think about trauma, I think about these guys and gals that have been, in the fight, say combat veterans. Whether they were World War II or Korea or Vietnam or the recent 20 years we've been in, and they come back with tremendous PTSD, and we know that. The statistic for a long time, I don't know if it's still the same, probably is you were losing 22 vets a day to suicide. I can't fathom what they must be going through. I've never been in a combat situation. I know that it's real, and so I'm very careful not to minimize anybody's trauma. What I'm saying is there is an infinite number of things that cause trauma. But there's very few things. There's only a few solutions to actually be able to deal with it effectively. And these are kind of some of the things that we're talking about. But to answer your question, I don't know if it ever really goes away, but I do think, for me speaking, this comes to a point where it no longer controls me.
Right. Kind of like the old, that's why the windshield is so big. And, you hear that all the time, and the rearview mirror is so small.
Yeah.
But sometimes you got to keep looking forward. I guess you can always kind of glance up in that rearview mirror, but if you try to focus on what's in front of you, kind of helps keep you in a more positive space.
Yeah, I honestly think that any traumas that you can effectively work through and deal with can go from a place of controlling you, where you feel like they're controlling you, to serving you. They can serve you in helping others. They can serve you in being more aware. They can serve you in being empathetic and being more aware of other people's conditions. And so that we talk about empaths and being sensitive. I think anybody that's been through any kind of trauma and has worked through it becomes much more aware and I think much more empathetic to others. Right. So I've been talking, but I mean, okay. You've certainly dealt with your own sense. Again,
I know. Well, you can't talk about combat vets and then come back to me, which I'm not.
We talked earlier.
I know we talked about
invalidate,
right.
One's not greater or less than the other.
Well,
it's just not, because it's your experience.
Right. I mean, it still has an effect on my life, and I brought certain things into our relationship that I didn't even know were there. Different fears that I'd brought from the past. So, I mean, any level, any scar per se is still there, but we can't talk about mine now.
No, I think we can't. So like you were saying earlier, like you were, journaling was cathartic to you, and you were, was helping you kind of deal through it initially as you were going through, like the immediacy or the initial impact.
And I think immediately I stepped into protect my children's emotion mode. So that meant shut down mine.
Mama bear.
So that I wasn't.
Right.
I felt like if I showed too much emotion, that would add more emotion on them, make them more sad for me. Mm-hmm. So I think I boxed a lot of that up, and I thought, oh, I'm fine, I'm over this. And then there's little things that pop up years and years down the road that I'm like, maybe I didn't quite deal with that.
Yeah, and so I kind of want to, that's the question I guess I have for you, but I will say that you always amaze me because you have this sense of empathy with you always, and there's always.
Why are you going to make me cry?
That's just true. I mean, like you have this sense of, you have this sense of awareness to be able to step out, and you're always willing to give people grace, way more than I am. I think as a matter of fact, you always kind of say you give me perspective sometimes when I'm just like ready to fight, and I think that's wonderful about you. And that's probably the reason why you were able to work through. By the time you were divorced to the time we met, you had come so far in your development, I think because a number of things, but you were willing to deal with it and deal with it effectively. And you weren't going to let it take away, the most beautiful parts of yourself, which are, empathy. But I'd like to know today, years after your divorce is final and we're in a healthy, semi-healthy relationship.
Semi?
No, so how do you deal with it today? Because we've talked about it.
Why are you going to cut to me when my eyes are all watery after you made me tear up? It's not fair.
Because this is a real podcast.
No, that's kind of what we're bringing up today is just that sometimes it can be an ongoing battle, whether it be big or small. Sometimes you think you have something beat and then it comes back up.
So in that moment, because this is really good for people who are listening, when you're there, I mean, it's easy to talk about it when you're not, but when you're right there and it's just really eating at you.
I get mad that I let it emotionally still have a hold on me.
And what does that look
I
like?
get mad at myself.
Do you take it out on people?
You have so many questions.
I do.
You really put me on the spot.
I do, yeah. That's a feel.
Well, yeah, it definitely can bleed over into, your other relationships and just your whole attitude of how you feel in that moment. If you're having feelings of anger, last time we talked about, keeping this positive light and this positive energy. Mm-hmm. So I get mad sometimes when I let that anger back in.
Do you have any tips or tricks of how you spin out of it so it doesn't last?
Well, I think.
Are you a stuffer?
I am a stuffer, yeah. But I think if I step back, try to step out of the emotion of it, which is hard. I mean, that's what's driving the feelings, is the emotion of it, and focus on where I am now, and try to quit living in the past during bad experiences. I mean, if I stop and say, "Look where you're at now, and how happy you are in the life you have," look, I'm going to cry. Why would I even waste my energy looking back?
Mm-hmm. I think that's great advice. And I think that's great advice for me and everyone else I think that's probably a good closing for us for this conversation.
Yeah, now that you've opened my emotional door.
Yes. Success. Is one, acknowledge that we all carry trauma. Two, be willing to say whatever it takes, I want to go and deal with it because it's only going to make my life and those lives that I touch more enriched and more and healthier. And then having the grit and I say grit, just having the courage to lean in instead of running from it because it's uncomfortable as hell. Lean into that. Whether it was a parent that was never around or whether it was, in a train accident, train wreck. I mean,
someone from a train wreck too.
I do actually. Somebody that was somebody that was hit. A couple
too many people.
I know, right? These stories, and they survive and they're fine. But my point is, be willing to acknowledge it, lean into it, let it have its work on you. Because you know what?
Well, it's like that old saying, which I know I'm not going to quote it right because I have a terrible memory, but something about like the only way to work through something is through it, which is to the point that you're trying to make. Sometimes you just have to let it wash over you.
Can't go under it, can't go around it, can't go over it. Got to go through it.
Feel it, and
because you know what? In every trauma, there's a lesson. There's a lesson, and that sounds so like cliche, but there
but
is.
yeah, if you can focus more on the lesson and less about the pain.
That's what I'm
that
saying.
that
So be
lesson
open
was.
to it and just be like fillet yourself open and let it listen to your intuition. Your intuition is going to tell you why why it's happening. I mean, I'm telling you, if you listen, if you're attentive, you're going to learn what the teachable moment is. It's probably a good way to say it, and then you can adjust. So be willing to do that, and then put the work in, and as an emotional filter, get it out however you can, through music, through speech, through video. Doesn't matter. Get it
And
out.
take baby steps if you have to take baby steps in the beginning, because I'm the kind of person, I can't deal with everything all up front at once when something's happening. I have to take it bite by bite. That's one of my coping mechanisms, and
Yeah.
it works very well for me.
Yeah.
And then once I'm in a little bit stronger place, I can kind of let a little more wash over me. I guess
Right.
I like to be a little more control of the waves. But
You
I
do.
do agree with you that you do have to sit there and feel it.
Yeah, and it's going to take a while, and don't invalidate yourself. Don't minimize the struggle and say, well,
I shouldn't
somebody
feel that way.
Somebody has it
It's-
worse than I
yeah.
do. Don't
Yeah.
do that, and then don't compare. Don't compare. And then I'd say the last thing is, if you have somebody trusted in your life that you can be open with, that's not going to judge you, that's going to be a supporter, that's going to be a
You're
champion.
gonna make me cry again. 'Cause that's
You know, utilize that. And if you don't, that's okay. It's not like you need that. You know, there's professionals out there you can speak to, counselors. Again, that's not necessary either. Don't feel like, oh, I can't afford a counselor or I can't afford professional help, therefore I can't get help. They're there as a resource, but I'm telling you, with what I just shared, is really what you're going to get in counseling. It's just you're going to pay more. You know, I mean, they're there to be a mirror,
Yeah.
so you can be your own mirror or
Yeah.
find that trusted person. Yeah.
Yeah. Or find you a Scott Sargent. I love you.
You can't afford me. No, I'm just kidding. All right. I love you.
Bye. I already said I love you.